Everyone believed the billionaire's fiancé was blind, until the black maid found the secret recording that changed everything. Wait, before you scroll away. I need you to hear this one, because I promise you, you've never heard anything like it. Everyone at that engagement party believed the future Mrs. Sterling was completely blind. They pitied her. They admired her courage. Even the billionaire she was about to marry believed it with his whole heart. But one woman standing quietly in that mansion, wearing a plain red uniform that nobody bothered to notice, knew something the other 300 guests didn't. And by the time the candles burned low that night, the truth she was holding in her hand would change everything. Hey friends, welcome back. Before we get into it, tell me, where are you watching from tonight, and which country do you call home? I love seeing this community stretch across the whole world. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told, about deception, dignity, and one maid who refused to stay silent when it mattered most. Stay with me till the end, because this one is going to stay with you. Nobody ever looks twice at the woman who cleans the chandeliers. Michelle Carter had learned that a long time ago. At 34 years old, she had spent 8 years inside the walls of the Sterling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, dusting marble busts nobody remembered the names of, polishing silver that cost more than her rent, and moving through rooms so grand they seemed to belong in a museum rather than a home. She had started working there back when Ethan Sterling's mother, Eleanor, was still alive, a quiet, kind woman who used to sit with Michelle in the kitchen some mornings and talk about nothing in particular, just to have someone to talk to. When Eleanor passed, Michelle had almost quit. It was Ethan who asked her to stay. "You're the only person left here who actually remembers my mother laughing," he had told her. She stayed. Now the halls of that estate were being strung with white orchids and hundreds of candles, because in 6 days, Ethan Sterling, 34 years old, self-made in the truest sense of the word, having built Sterling Voss Capital from a single office in Stamford into a firm managing billions, was getting engaged. The whole of Fairfield County had been talking about it for weeks. Everyone wanted to know about the woman who had, in the span of 18 months, gone from a stranger at a charity gala to the woman photographed on Ethan Sterling's arm at every event from New York to Newport. Her name was Vivian Marsh. She was 32, elegant in the effortless way that made other women in the room feel slightly underdressed and completely blind. That was the story everyone knew. 5 years ago, before she ever met Ethan, Vivian had been in a car accident on a rain-slicked road outside Hartford. She had survived. Her sight hadn't. She never hid it, never made excuses for it. If anything, people said, she wore it with a kind of grace that made her seem stronger than anyone else in the room. She used a slim black cane with a silver handle, engraved with her initials. She wore soft blindfolded style shades at outdoor events where the light bothered her eyes, she said. Reporters loved her. Society pages called her the billionaire's brave bride-to-be. Ethan, people whispered, had fallen for her not despite the accident but partly because of how she carried it, never asking for pity, never letting it slow her down. Michelle had heard the story 100 times from 100 different mouths at 100 different parties. And for the first year, she believed it completely, the same as everyone else. It was the small things that started to bother her. It began on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 months before the engagement party, when Michelle was refilling the flower arrangements in the west sitting room. Vivian was alone in there, sitting by the window with a magazine open on her lap, an actual magazine, glossy pages spread wide, the kind with photographs of runway dresses on every page. Michelle didn't think anything of it at first. Maybe she just liked the feel of the paper. But then Vivian turned a page, paused, and said quietly to herself, almost under her breath, "That color would never work on me," while looking directly at a spread of emerald green gowns. Michelle told herself she'd misheard. Or maybe someone had described the photo to her earlier and she was simply remembering it. There were a dozen innocent explanations. She didn't say anything. It wasn't her place, and besides, who was she to question a woman engaged to the man who signed her paycheck? But then there was the second time. And the third. There was the evening Vivian walked down the grand staircase without her cane, without a hand on the railing, in low light, moving with the kind of casual confidence that a person who has genuinely lost their sight takes years, if ever, to rebuild. There was the afternoon Michelle watched, from across the courtyard, as Vivian expertly applied a full face of makeup in front of her vanity mirror, blending contour along her cheekbones with a precision that no sighted makeup artist could have taught a blind woman to fake, not even with years of practice. Michelle stood frozen in the hallway that day for almost a full minute, a stack of folded towels in her arms, watching a woman who was supposedly blind check her own reflection twice before deciding she was happy with it. Still, Michelle said nothing. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself that grief and trauma did strange things to people, that maybe some days were better than others, that maybe there were things about blindness she simply didn't understand. She had a daughter at home, 12 years old, bright and hungry for a future that this job was slowly building for her, one paycheck at a time. Michelle was not a woman who went looking for trouble. She kept her head down, did her work well, and minded the boundary between the people who owned the house and the people who cleaned it. But grief and doubt have a way of sitting in the chest even when the mouth stays shut. And that Tuesday in March was the day something in Michelle quietly shifted. Not into suspicion exactly, not yet, but into a kind of watchfulness she couldn't turn off, no matter how hard she tried. She had no idea, standing there with an armful of white orchids, that in 3 months' time, on the night of the biggest party the Sterling estate had hosted in a decade, she would be the one holding a phone in her hand, the one thing that would bring the entire glittering room to a dead, stunned silence. She just knew, deep down, that something about Vivian Marsh did not add up. And in that house, on that estate, nobody had ever taught Michelle Carter to ignore what her gut was telling her. She almost missed it. If she had walked past that door 30 seconds earlier or later, none of what came next would have happened. It was a Thursday night, 10 days before the engagement party, and the house was quiet in the particular way old mansions get quiet. Not silent, exactly, just full of small sounds. Pipes settling. Wind against old glass. Michelle was on her way to the laundry room at the far end of the east wing, arms full of table linens that needed pressing for the caterer's walk through the next morning, when she noticed a thin line of light under the door of the small study Vivian had claimed as her own since moving into the guest wing 6 months earlier. It was almost 11 at night. Ethan was in New York for a board meeting and wasn't due back until the weekend. Michelle wasn't in the habit of paying attention to who was where in that enormous house. With 22 rooms, people came and went and she rarely crossed paths with the family after dark. But the door was cracked open just slightly, and through the gap, Michelle heard Vivian's voice, low, clipped, and entirely unlike the soft, warm tone she used in front of Ethan or the staff. "I told you not to call this number," Vivian was saying. "If he finds this phone, everything falls apart. We are 10 days out. 10 days, and then none of this will matter anymore." Michelle stopped walking. She knew, with total certainty, that she should keep going. This was not her business. Whatever conversation Vivian Marsh was having at 11 o'clock at night on a phone she clearly didn't want anyone to know she owned was between her and whoever was on the other end of that call. And yet Michelle's feet didn't move. "He still thinks I can't see the paperwork," Vivian continued, and there was something in her voice now, something almost amused, almost proud. "That's the bobble of playing this part so well for 2 years. Nobody double-checks anything you sign when they feel sorry for you." There was a pause. Then a short, sharp laugh, Vivian's real laugh, Michelle realized with a small jolt, not the gentle, measured one she used at dinner parties. "The transfer goes through the week after the wedding," Vivian said. "Once I'm his wife, once the prenup is void because of the trust restructuring his lawyer doesn't know I've already seen, that's when it's done. That's when I don't need the cane, the glasses, any of it, ever again." Michelle stood in that hallway holding a stack of table linens, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Vivian could hear it through the door. She thought of Ethan, of the way he looked at Vivian across a room like she was the only steady thing in his entire overbuilt, overscheduled life. She thought of Eleanor Sterling, gone 6 years now, who had sat with Michelle in that same kitchen and once said, half joking, half not, "The money's never been the hard part for my son, Michelle. Trusting people is the hard part." She thought about her own daughter, waiting for her at home, and the mortgage payment due on the first of the month, and how very easy it would be to simply walk past this door, finish pressing the linens, and go home to bed and forget she had heard anything at all. Instead, Michelle did something she would later be unable to fully explain, even to herself. She took out her own phone, angled it toward the thin gap in the doorway, and pressed record. She didn't get much. 11 seconds of shaky, half-focused footage capturing only the edge of Vivian's shoulder and the sound of her voice, before Michelle's hands started shaking too badly to hold the phone steady and she backed away from the door, heart slamming, and hurried down the hall toward the laundry room like she'd been the one caught doing something wrong. She sat on the folding table in that laundry room for almost 20 minutes afterward, phone clutched in her lap, replaying those 11 seconds over and over, quiet enough that no one in the house would hear the tinny sound of Vivian's own voice condemning her. 11 seconds wasn't proof of anything a court would care about. It wasn't even proof, really, just a fragment, a shard of a much bigger conversation Michelle had only caught the tail end of. She didn't know what the transfer meant exactly, or what paperwork Vivian was talking about, or who was on the other end of that call. She only knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that the woman planning to marry Ethan Sterling in front of 300 guests in 10 days was not who anyone in that house believed her to be. Michelle didn't sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, 11 miles from the estate, turning the same question over and over in her mind. The same question that would follow her through the next 10 days like a shadow she couldn't shake. Do I say something? And if I do, who in this world is going to believe the maid over the woman about to become Mrs. Sterling? She had no way of knowing yet that the answer to that question would arrive on its own, 10 days later, in the middle of the most important night of Ethan Sterling's life, and that when it did, she wouldn't have to convince anyone of anything. The truth was going to speak for itself. By the 4th day, Michelle had stopped telling herself she was going to let it go. She still hadn't told anyone. Not her sister, not her best friend Dolores, who worked 2 towns over as a home health aide and always had good advice, not even her own daughter, who noticed her mother had been quieter than usual at dinner all week. Michelle carried the secret the way she carried everything hard in her life, alone, at first, until she could figure out what to do with it. But 11 seconds of shaky phone footage wasn't enough. She knew that. If she brought this to Ethan Sterling and it turned out to be nothing, a misunderstanding, an out-of-context joke, some private matter that had a perfectly innocent explanation, she wouldn't just lose her job. She'd lose the only home she had left in this world, the house where Eleanor Sterling used to sit with her and talk about nothing over coffee, the house that had, in its strange and complicated way, become the closest thing to family Michelle had after her own mother passed. So on the Friday before the party, when Vivian left the estate for what she said was a wellness retreat day at a spa in Westport, driven there, of course, by the estate's driver, since a blind woman couldn't very well drive herself, Michelle found herself standing outside the guest wing study with a key she wasn't supposed to have. She'd found it 2 years earlier, in a drawer in the housekeeping office, on a ring labeled simply Guest Wing, Miscellaneous. She had never used it for anything other than emergencies, a burst pipe once, a smoke alarm malfunction another time. She told herself this counted as an emergency too. Maybe the biggest one she'd ever face in this house. The study was small and orderly, decorated the way Vivian decorated everything. Soft, tasteful, deliberately unremarkable, like a woman who had learned that the less attention a room drew, the less anyone thought to look closely at it. Michelle didn't know exactly what she was searching for. She only had 20 minutes before the car was due back, and her hands were shaking the entire time. She found the phone in the second drawer of the writing desk, tucked beneath a stack of unused stationery. It wasn't locked. What Michelle saw in the next 4 minutes changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. There were text messages, dozens of them, between Vivian and a contact saved only as D. The messages went back almost 2 years, long before Vivian had ever met Ethan Sterling at that charity gala everyone loved to talk about. And reading them, Michelle understood, with a sick drop in her stomach, that the gala had never been an accident at all. Here's exactly the profile we talked about. One message from Vivian read, dated nearly 2 years back. Self-made, guarded with women who want him for the money, but soft for anyone who reminds him of his mother. The blind angle is perfect. Nobody questions a woman who's already suffered. Dee had replied, make sure the accident story holds up if anyone digs. I already handled the hospital records in Hartford. You were never a patient there. Don't let that slip. Michelle's hands went cold. There it was. Not a rumor. Not a misunderstanding. Proof, in Vivian's own words, that the accident, the entire foundation of the story that had made 300 people fall in love with her, that had made Ethan Sterling, a man sharp enough to build a billion-dollar firm, lower every guard he had never happened at all. The blindness wasn't trauma. It wasn't grief wearing a brave face. It was a costume, built and rehearsed and maintained for 2 solid years, aimed at one target. Ethan Sterling. But it was the messages from just 6 weeks ago that made Michelle sit down hard in the desk chair, her legs no longer willing to hold her. Dee wasn't just a partner in the lie. He was Vivian's husband. Once the prenup voids after the trust restructuring goes through post-wedding, one message read, we take the 40 and disappear before the annulment paperwork even gets filed. Nobody contests a blind wife settlement in the press. It'll look monstrous if he tries. 40. Michelle didn't know if that meant 40,000 or 40 million, but knowing this family, knowing the world Ethan Sterling moved through, she had a sick feeling it wasn't the smaller number. And underneath that message, one more, sent only 3 days earlier, that Michelle read twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Almost there, baby. 10 more days and Mrs. Sterling retires the cane for good. Then it's you and me and 40 million reasons to disappear somewhere he'll never find us. Michelle sat frozen in that chair for a long moment, the phone heavy and damning in her hands, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in the quiet room. This wasn't a woman who had simply lied about a disability out of some private insecurity. This wasn't even, really, about money in the ordinary sense of a woman marrying up. This was a plan. Built over 2 years. Aimed, with total precision, at a man who had lost his mother, who had spent his whole guarded life waiting for someone to finally see past the money, and who had, in Vivian Marsh, finally believed he'd found her. Michelle thought of Ethan's face at dinner 2 nights ago, the way he gently guided Vivian's hand to her water glass without being asked, the quiet, practiced tenderness of a man who had built his entire understanding of this relationship around protecting someone he believed was vulnerable. She thought about how many times over the past 2 years she had watched him soften in ways she'd never once seen him soften for anyone else, not even for the women before Vivian who had wanted him for exactly the reasons DS messages described so coldly. She took photos. 12 of them, capturing every message she could before her 20 minutes ran out, her hands trembling so badly that 3 of the photos came out blurred and she had to retake them. She had just slipped the phone back beneath the stationery, exactly where she'd found it, when she heard, from down the hallway, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening 2 hours earlier than planned, and Vivian Marsh's voice, calm and light and utterly convincing, calling out to ask if anyone had seen where she'd left her cane. Michelle had 11 seconds to decide what to do next. She chose to walk out of that study exactly the way she'd walked into 1,000 other rooms in that house over 8 years. Quiet, unnoticed, invisible. But for the first time in her life, Michelle Carter was no longer just the woman who cleaned the chandeliers. She was the only person in that entire mansion who knew the truth. And in 6 days, at the biggest party that house had seen in a decade, she was going to have to decide what to do with it. She couldn't sleep. She could barely eat. And worst of all, she couldn't stop watching Vivian's face for cracks she now knew were never going to show. The weekend passed in a strange, suspended kind of quiet. Michelle went through her regular duties, pressing linens, polishing the silver that would be used at the party, walking the caterers through the kitchen layout, all while carrying, in the inside pocket of her uniform, a phone with 12 photographs that could end a wedding, destroy a woman's carefully built disguise, and possibly cost Michelle everything she had. She thought about calling the police. She sat with her thumb hovering over the number twice that weekend and put the phone down both times. What would she even say? "I broke into a guest's private study and photographed her phone without permission" wasn't the kind of sentence that made anyone sound like the hero of the story, no matter how true the rest of it was. She had no legal right to be in that room. She knew, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent her whole life being underestimated, that if this went wrong, it wouldn't be Vivian who ended up in trouble. It would be her. So she thought about going to Ethan directly instead. Twice she almost did it. Once on Saturday morning, when she passed him in the east hallway, dressed down in a grey sweater, looking more like a tired, lonely man than the billionaire the papers loved to write about. He'd smiled at her, the easy, familiar smile he'd had since he was a boy trailing after his mother in that same hallway, and said, "Big week, huh, Michelle? You holding up?" And she had almost said it right there. "Ethan, I need to show you something, and I need you to trust me," but the words caught somewhere behind her teeth, and instead she just smiled back and said, "Almost there," and kept walking, hating herself a little with every step. The second time was Sunday evening, when she found him alone in his study, going over table assignments with a tired crease between his eyebrows. She stood in the doorway for almost a full minute, phone in her pocket, screen unlocked, 12 photographs one tap away from changing his life forever. And then Vivian's voice had drifted in from the hallway behind her, light, warm, calling Ethan's name, and Michelle had stepped back into the shadow of the doorway and let the moment pass. It wasn't cowardice, not exactly. It was something closer to responsibility. Michelle understood, in a way that maybe only someone who had spent a lifetime being careful could understand, that a truth this big couldn't be dropped carelessly into a man's lap and walked away from. If she was going to do this, if she was really going to be the one to tell Ethan Sterling that the woman he loved had built their entire relationship as an elaborate act, she needed to do it in a way he couldn't dismiss, couldn't explain away, couldn't have Vivian talk her way out of with tears and wounded confusion. Because Michelle had watched Vivian operate for 2 years now. She was good. She was, Michelle had to admit with a kind of chilled respect, one of the best liars she had ever witnessed in her life. If this came down to Michelle's word against Vivian's performance, Michelle would lose. Every time. She needed proof Vivian couldn't spin. And more than that, she needed a moment Vivian couldn't control. It was Monday, 4 days before the party, when the idea started to take shape. Michelle was in the kitchen, helping the catering coordinator finalize the timeline for the event, when she overheard something that changed the entire plan forming in her mind. The head of catering was talking about the toast, the traditional moment near the end of the party when the couple would stand together in the grand foyer beneath the chandelier, and Ethan would say a few words in front of all 300 guests before Vivian said her own. It was, the coordinator said, going to be filmed by 3 separate photographers and live-streamed to the guests who couldn't make it, including several members of the Sterling family watching from overseas. 300 witnesses. Cameras rolling. A moment Vivian herself had likely planned down to the smallest detail, because women like Vivian always planned for their own audience. Michelle realized, standing there with a stack of napkins in her hands, that this wasn't a problem to be solved quietly in a hallway. This needed to happen in front of everyone. Not because Michelle wanted a spectacle, she wasn't that kind of person, had never once in her life wanted to be the center of a room, but because she understood something Vivian had built her entire scheme around exploiting. People rarely double-check what happens in front of them when they've already decided how they feel about someone. If Michelle showed Ethan the phone quietly beforehand, Vivian would have time. Time to cry, to explain, to twist the story into something softer, to convince him it was a misunderstanding before he even had time to process what he'd seen. But if the truth came out in that foyer, under that chandelier, in front of 300 witnesses and a live stream, Vivian would have nowhere to run and no time to perform her way out of it. It was a terrifying thought. It meant Michelle would have to stand in the middle of the most important night of Ethan Sterling's life and hand him something that would break his heart in front of everyone he knew. It meant risking her job, her reputation, possibly even legal trouble for how she'd obtained the evidence in the first place. But she kept thinking about Eleanor Sterling in that kitchen, all those mornings years ago, saying, "The money's never been the hard part for my son, Michelle. Trusting people is the hard part." Eleanor wasn't there to protect her son anymore. But Michelle was. That night, alone in her apartment after her daughter had gone to bed, Michelle sat at her small kitchen table and began, very carefully, to plan exactly how she was going to do it. What she would say, when she would move, how she would make sure that when the truth finally came out, it would come out in a way that no one, not even Vivian Marsh, could talk their way around. She had 4 days left. And for the first time since she'd found that phone in the desk drawer, Michelle Carter didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. The morning of the party, Michelle woke up before her alarm, the way people do when their body already knows the day ahead is going to matter. Her daughter, Amora, was still asleep down the hall. Michelle stood in the kitchen making coffee she didn't drink, staring out the small window over the sink at a sky just starting to turn grey gold, and thought about all the ways this day could go. In some of those versions, she lost her job by nightfall. In some, she lost more than that. But in every version she'd played out over the last 3 sleepless nights, there was one thing she couldn't let herself walk away from. The image of Ethan Sterling standing at that altar, or under that chandelier, saying vows to a woman who had already spent his mother's memory as a weapon to get close to him. She left for the estate 2 hours earlier than she needed to. The Sterling grounds, when she arrived, were already transformed. White orchids climbed every archway. A small army of caterers moved through the kitchen like a single coordinated organism. Musicians were setting up in the ballroom, testing microphones that would later carry 2 people's promises out over 300 witnesses. It was, Michelle had to admit, achingly beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made it almost impossible to believe that anything real could go wrong inside it. She found Ethan around 10 that morning in the small breakfast room off the East Wing, alone, still in a plain white undershirt, going over final notes for his toast on a legal pad, a coffee going cold beside him. He looked up when she came in with fresh linens for the sideboard and gave her a tired smile. "Big day," he said. "Big day," she agreed, and something in her voice must have carried more weight than she meant it to, because he set down his pen and looked at her more closely. "You okay, Michelle? You've seemed off all week." For one long moment, she almost told him right there. The words were right at the edge of her mouth. "Ethan, before this day goes any further, I need you to see something." But she had promised herself this needed to happen in front of everyone. In a moment Vivian couldn't outperform, and a breakfast room at 10 in the morning wasn't that moment. "Not yet. Just want everything to be perfect for you today," she said instead, and it wasn't even a lie. She busied herself with the linens and left before he could ask anything more. By early afternoon, the guests had begun to arrive in earnest, a river of black tuxedos and gowns in every jewel tone, diamonds catching the light of the chandeliers, voices rising and mixing into that particular hum of old money gathered in one room. Michelle moved through it all in her uniform, invisible in the way staff always were at these events, refilling champagne, directing photographers, quietly keeping the machine of the party running while the guests forgot she existed at all. She saw Vivian only once before the toast, from across the ballroom, being helped into a stunning blush-pink gown by 2 assistants, her hair swept up, sapphire and diamond earrings catching the light, her cane resting against the wall of the dressing room like a prop waiting for its cue. Vivian was laughing at something one of the assistants said, a real, easy laugh, relaxed in a way that made Michelle's stomach turn, because she now understood exactly how much practice had gone into making that laugh look effortless. At 6:30, the toast was set to begin. Michelle had spent every spare minute of the last 4 days finding out exactly how the moment would unfold, memorizing it the way a soldier memorizes a battlefield. Ethan and Vivian would stand together beneath the grand chandelier in the foyer at the base of the staircase, the same spot where, 6 days earlier, Michelle had first stood outside a cracked open door and heard Vivian's real voice for the first time. 3 photographers would be positioned around the room. A live stream camera would be running, feeding the moment out to family members watching from London and Singapore who couldn't make the trip. Ethan would speak first, a few words about love and gratitude and how he'd never expected, after everything, to find someone who saw him rather than his bank account. Then Vivian would speak. That was the moment Michelle had chosen. Not before Ethan's toast, which would only make it about her interrupting him. Not after Vivian's toast finished, when the room would already be swept up in applause and champagne toasts, and it would feel, to everyone watching, like Michelle was simply trying to ruin something beautiful out of spite. She had chosen the exact gap between the two. After Ethan's words had settled into the room, warm and vulnerable and true, and before Vivian had the chance to answer them with a performance built on 2 years of lies. At 6:25, Michelle stood near the edge of the foyer, phone in her apron pocket, screen already unlocked to the gallery of 12 photographs, her heart beating so hard she was sure the guests nearest her could hear it over the string quartet. She watched Ethan take his position beneath the chandelier, watched him reach for Vivian's hand and guide her gently to stand beside him. A small, practiced kindness that no longer looked touching to Michelle. It looked like evidence. The room quieted. 300 faces turned toward the staircase. The live stream camera's small red light blinked on. Ethan cleared his throat, looked down at Vivian with an expression of such open, unguarded love that Michelle felt something twist painfully in her own chest, and began to speak. 5 years ago, he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed foyer. I didn't believe anyone could love me for anything other than what I could give them. And then I met a woman who couldn't even see my face when we first spoke, and somehow, she saw more of who I actually am than anyone else ever had. A soft, collective sound moved through the crowd. The particular hum of 300 people simultaneously moved to tears. Michelle's hand tightened around the phone in her pocket. Vivian, Ethan continued, turning fully toward her now, his voice thick with emotion. You taught me that the most important things in life were never the things I could see. He reached into his jacket pocket and, to a fresh gasp from the crowd, produced a small velvet box, not the engagement ring, which already sat on Vivian's hand, but something else entirely, something clearly planned as a surprise for this exact moment. So tonight, in front of everyone who loves us, I wanted to give you something that's just for you. He opened the box. Inside, nestled in white silk, was a pair of diamond earrings shaped like tiny, delicate stars. Earrings, Michelle realized with a cold jolt, that a blind woman would never be able to appreciate the sight of, only the feel of. It was, in its own way, the cruelest possible gift for the truth Michelle alone knew was hiding beneath Vivian's calm, grateful smile. And Vivian, on cue, brought both hands to her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes, playing the moment with the same flawless precision she'd played every moment for the last 2 years. Michelle stepped forward. This was it. This was the gap. This was the only window she was going to get. She pulled the phone from her apron pocket, her thumb finding the gallery icon, and began to walk toward the center of that hushed, chandeliered room. 300 faces, a live stream camera, and one billionaire about to learn the truth, all waiting on the other side of the next 10 seconds. 10 seconds can feel like an entire lifetime when you're the only person in a room who knows what's about to happen. Michelle's shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as she crossed the space between the edge of the foyer and the small crowd gathered directly beneath the chandelier, phone held low against her side, thumb still resting on the gallery icon. A few heads turned as she moved, a caterer here, a bridesmaid there, the mild, automatic curiosity people show when household staff cross into a part of the room they don't usually occupy. Nobody stopped her. Nobody expected the maid to be the one thing standing between this wedding and the truth. Vivian was still wiping delicately at the corner of one eye, the star-shaped earrings glittering in the box Ethan held open between them, when Michelle stepped into the small circle of space beneath the chandelier. "Mr. Sterling," Michelle said, and her voice, though quiet, carried in the sudden hush the way a single dropped glass carries across a silent room. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. But there's something you need to see before this goes any further." The reaction rippled outward in stages. Ethan's face shifted first, confusion, then a flicker of concern, the natural response of a man used to staff only interrupting him for genuine emergencies. Vivian's face shifted next, and it was this second reaction that Michelle had spent 4 days preparing herself to watch closely, because she knew, better than anyone else in that room, exactly how good an actress Vivian Marsh truly was. For 1/2 second, so brief that Michelle doubted anyone else in the room caught it, something cold and sharp moved behind Vivian's eyes. Not confusion. Not the mild social embarrassment of a stranger interrupting an intimate moment. Recognition. Vivian knew, the instant she heard Michelle's voice, exactly what this was. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a soft, bewildered smile aimed in the general direction of Michelle's voice, the practiced expression of a blind woman politely confused by an unexpected interruption. "Michelle," Ethan said, his brow furrowing. "What's going on? This isn't really the—" "I know how this looks," Michelle said, and she made herself keep her voice steady, even though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to turn around and disappear back into the crowd where she belonged. "And I know I have no right to be the one standing here right now. But I've worked for your family for 8 years, Mr. Sterling. Your mother trusted me in this house. And I couldn't stand here tonight and let you make a promise to someone without knowing the truth first." A murmur moved through the surrounding guests, low and uncertain, the sound of 300 people simultaneously deciding whether to look away out of politeness or lean in out of the very human hunger to witness something they weren't supposed to see. "Michelle, whatever this is," Ethan said, his voice tightening now, embarrassment beginning to color his confusion, "this really isn't the time." "She's not blind, Mr. Sterling." The words landed in that foyer like a dropped glass finally shattering. For a moment, nobody moved. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a champagne flute clinked softly against a tray as a server froze mid-step. The string quartet, who had been about to begin a soft interlude, let their bows hover motionless above the strings. Vivian's hand found Ethan's arm, her fingers gripping with theatrical urgency. "Ethan, I don't understand what's happening. Why is she saying this?" "I'm not saying it to hurt anyone," Michelle continued, forcing herself to keep looking at Ethan and not at the rising panic beginning to crack through the corners of Vivian's composure. "I'm saying it because I have proof, and because I think, more than anyone in this room, you deserve to see it before you make a promise you can't take back." She held up her phone. 6 days ago, I overheard Miss Marsh on a call, saying things a blind woman planning her wedding shouldn't be saying. I know I had no right to look further into it. I know what I did next could get me fired, or worse. But 4 days ago, I found messages on a phone hidden in her study. Messages between her and a man named D, going back nearly 2 years, from before she ever met you. "This is insane," Vivian said, her voice climbing now, tears, real or performed. Michelle genuinely couldn't tell anymore, spilling down her cheeks. "Ethan, she's clearly unwell, or someone's paid her to do this. I don't know what this is, but I'm not going to stand here and be accused of." "The messages talk about the accident in Hartford," Michelle said, cutting through Vivian's rising voice with a steadiness she didn't know she had left in her. "About hospital records that were handled so no one could check them. About a trust restructuring that voids the prenup after the wedding. About $40 million, Mr. Sterling, and a man she calls Baby who she plans to disappear with 10 days after the wedding." The color drained visibly from Ethan Sterling's face. He looked, for the first time since Michelle had known him, genuinely and completely lost. A man standing in the wreckage of a story he had believed with his whole heart, watching the floor open beneath him in front of 300 witnesses and a live stream camera still quietly recording every second of it. "That's not," Vivian started, and for the first time, her voice cracked in a way that sounded less rehearsed. "Ethan, don't listen to her, please. Whatever she thinks she saw, she's twisting it, she doesn't understand." "Twisting what, exactly?" Ethan said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very still. The particular stillness Michelle had seen in him only once before, the day the board tried to force him out of his own company years ago, and he had, instead of raising his voice, gone completely, dangerously calm. Michelle hasn't shown anyone anything yet. Vivian. What is it you think she's twisting? The question hung in the air between them, and Michelle watched something in Vivian's face finally, truly break, not the practiced tears from a moment ago, but something rawer and far less controlled, the look of a woman realizing, in real time, in front of 300 witnesses, that the performance she had built over 2 years had just run out of road. "Show him," Michelle said quietly, holding the phone out toward Ethan, her hand steady even though the rest of her was shaking. "I'm sorry it has to be like this. But I couldn't let you find out after the vows instead of before them." Ethan took the phone from her hand slowly, like it weighed far more than the small weight of glass and metal it actually was. And under the chandelier, in front of 300 guests, a live stream camera, and the woman he had believed loved him more honestly than anyone else ever had, Ethan Sterling began to read. The silence while Ethan read stretched long enough that Michelle began to count her own heartbeats to keep herself from either crying or running. She watched his thumb move across the screen, scrolling slowly through the 12 photographs she'd taken with shaking hands 4 days earlier. She watched his jaw tighten. She watched him stop scrolling once, go completely still, then read the same message again, as if he was hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating the second time. Around them, 300 guests stood frozen in a kind of collective held breath, the particular silence of people who understand, without being told, that they are witnessing something they will talk about for the rest of their lives. Somewhere near the back, a woman whispered something to her husband and was quickly shushed. The live stream camera's small red light continued to blink, steady and merciless, carrying every second of it out to family members watching from London and Singapore who had no idea they were about to witness the unraveling of a wedding instead of the beginning of one. Vivian had gone very quiet. The tears were still there, but something behind her eyes had shifted, the desperate calculation of a performer watching her audience realize, all at once, that the show was over. "Ethan," she tried again, softer now, reaching for his arm. "Please. Whatever you're reading, there's an explanation, there's context you don't." "Who is Dee?" Ethan asked. He didn't look up from the phone. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will in front of 300 people. Vivian didn't answer. "Vivian." He looked up now, and Michelle saw something in his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not rage, not yet, but a kind of devastated clarity, the look of a man watching 2 years of memories rearrange themselves in real time into something entirely different than what he'd believed them to be. "Who is Dee?" It was, in the end, not Vivian who answered the question. It was the sound of the front doors of the estate opening, heavy and sudden, and a man's voice, clipped, urgent, carrying the particular panic of someone who has just realized a carefully laid plan is collapsing in real time, calling out from the entrance hall. Viv, we have to go, right now, there's a problem with the..." The man froze mid-sentence in the archway leading into the foyer, 300 faces turning toward him in perfect unison, and Michelle understood, before anyone said a single word, that she was looking at Dee for the first time. He was younger than Michelle had expected, mid-30s, dressed in a way that suggested he'd been waiting somewhere close by, close enough to arrive within minutes of a plan going wrong. His eyes found Vivian's across the crowded foyer, and in that single locked glance, Michelle watched 2 years of careful lying collapse in front of 300 witnesses without either of them saying a word. "Daniel," Ethan said quietly, and Michelle realized with a small jolt that Ethan somehow already knew the name, that some part of Daniel's identity, perhaps a business associate's face half remembered from some overlapping circle, had clicked into place the moment he walked through that door. "You're the trust attorney's associate. You reviewed the restructuring paperwork 6 weeks ago." The room seemed to hold its breath even harder, if that was possible. Michelle hadn't known that detail, hadn't understood, until that exact moment, just how deep the deception had run, that Daniel hadn't simply been a lover waiting in the wings but had somehow inserted himself into the very legal process meant to protect Ethan's fortune from exactly this kind of scheme. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face had already answered for him, the color draining from it as he understood, standing frozen in that archway, that he had walked directly into the one moment he'd spent 2 years trying to prevent. "Get him out of my house," Ethan said, and though his voice never rose above a controlled, quiet register, something in it carried enough weight that 2 of the private security staff stationed near the entrance moved instantly, closing in on Daniel before he could take another step backward toward the door. "Ethan, please," Vivian said, and the performance had fully cracked now, her voice raw in a way Michelle had never heard from her before, stripped of every carefully rehearsed inflection. "Please, just let me explain, it wasn't always about the money, I promise you, somewhere in these 2 years it stopped being just about the money." "Don't," Ethan said. Just that. One word, quiet and final, and something in the way he said it made even the murmuring crowd fall completely silent again. He looked down at the phone still in his hand, then back up at Vivian, really looked at her, Michelle thought, for what might have been the first time all night, not through the lens of 2 years of careful devotion but with the clear, cold eyes of a man finally seeing the person standing in front of him. "My mother used to tell me," he said, his voice carrying now, deliberately, to every corner of that silent foyer, "that the people who love you the least are usually the ones who work hardest to convince you they love you the most. I thought about that every single day after she died, wondering if I'd ever meet anyone who didn't need to work that hard." He paused. "I finally understand what she meant." He turned to the head of his security team, standing near the base of the staircase, and said, with a steadiness that Michelle would later realize had probably cost him everything he had left, "Get the family attorney on the phone. Now. And get every one of our guests something to eat and drink. This is not going to ruin their evening, whatever else happens tonight." Then, and only then, in front of 300 stunned guests, a live stream camera still quietly recording, and a fiancée whose engagement ring still caught the light on her trembling hand, Ethan Sterling turned to look at Michelle Carter, the woman who had spent 8 years cleaning his family's chandeliers, unnoticed, invisible, easy to overlook, and said the words that would, in the days and weeks that followed, completely rewrite the course of both their lives. "Michelle," he said quietly, "I think you just saved me from the worst mistake of my life." The days that followed the party moved in a blur that Michelle would later struggle to fully piece back together. Daniel was escorted off the property that same night, though what happened to him afterward, whether Ethan's legal team pursued fraud charges, whether Vivian's real identity, which, it would turn out over the following weeks, wasn't even legally Vivian Marsh at all, but a name she and Daniel had built together specifically for this purpose, ever became public, stayed largely behind closed doors, handled quietly by a team of attorneys who understood that the Sterling family's privacy was worth protecting even in the wreckage of a scandal this large. What Michelle did know, because she lived it, was what happened to her own life in the week that followed. She fully expected to be fired. Despite what Ethan had said in that stunned, grateful moment beneath the chandelier, Michelle understood the reality of what she'd actually done. Let herself into a guest's private study without permission, gone through someone's personal phone, taken photographs of information that, however damning, she'd had no legal right to access. She spent the days after the party half waiting for a call from the estate's lawyer instead of from Ethan himself, bracing herself for the very real possibility that doing the right thing was still, technically, going to cost her the job that had supported her and her daughter for 8 years. The call came on a Thursday morning, 4 days after the party. It wasn't the estate's lawyer. It was Ethan. He asked her to come to the house, not to work, he was careful to clarify, just to talk. Michelle drove out that afternoon with her stomach in knots, rehearsing explanations and apologies the entire way, certain she was about to hear the words she'd been dreading since the moment she'd first pressed record outside that study door 6 days before the party. Instead, she found Ethan sitting in the same small breakfast room where she'd seen him the morning of the party, looking older than she remembered, the kind of tired that comes from something deeper than lost sleep. He gestured for her to sit, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all, just turned a coffee cup slowly between his hands. "I've been going over the last 2 years," he finally said. "Every dinner. Every trip. Every moment I thought I finally understood what it meant to be loved without an agenda attached to it. And the whole time, the only person in that house who ever actually risked something to protect me was the person I probably knew the least. Michelle didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, letting him get to wherever he was going. You could have lost everything by doing what you did, he continued. Your job. Possibly worse, legally, if I'd wanted to make an issue of how you got that information, and believe me, my lawyers wanted to make an issue of it. I told them no. He looked up at her then, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face that Michelle had never once seen in 8 years of watching him move through that house like a man perpetually bracing for disappointment. You didn't have to do any of it, Michelle. Nobody would have blamed you for staying quiet. It wasn't your fight. Your mother used to tell me something too, Michelle said quietly, the words coming easier now that she understood he wasn't about to fire her. She used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching. It's what they do when they think no one will ever find out. She paused. I couldn't sit in that laundry room, knowing what I knew, and just let you walk into that. Not after everything your family's given me. Not after everything your mother meant to me. Something shifted in Ethan's face. Grief and gratitude tangled together in a way that made him look, for just a moment, achingly like the boy Eleanor used to describe from his childhood, before the company, before the money, before he'd learned to guard every part of himself so carefully. I want to do something for you, he said. And I don't want you to argue with me about it, because I've already decided, and I'm a very stubborn man when I've decided something. He slid a folder across the table toward her. Michelle opened it slowly, and it took her a long moment to understand what she was looking at. A full college scholarship fund, established that week, in her daughter Amora's name, covering not just tuition but housing and living expenses through a full 4-year degree at any university she chose to attend. Beneath it, a second document. The deed to a small house, fully paid, 3 miles from the Sterling estate, in a quiet neighborhood with good schools, already in Michelle's name. Mr. Sterling, I can't. You can, he said simply. And you're going to. Not because I feel sorry for you, and not because I'm trying to buy your silence about any of this. Frankly, I don't care who knows what happened at that party, because the truth was never something I was ashamed of. I'm doing this because 8 years ago, my mother told me you were the only person in this house who ever made her laugh after my father died, and because 6 days ago, you were the only person in this house brave enough to save me from the worst decision of my life. I don't know how to repay something like that. I'm not sure this even comes close. But I'm going to try anyway. Michelle sat there for a long moment, the folder open in her lap, thinking about every quiet, invisible year she'd spent in that house. Dusting chandeliers nobody looked twice at, polishing silver for parties she'd never be invited to, being the kind of person the world had trained her to believe mattered less than the people she served. And she thought, too, about her daughter, asleep down the hall in their small apartment, dreaming dreams that had always felt, until this exact moment, just slightly out of reach. Thank you, she finally said, her voice thick. Not just for this. For not making me feel foolish for caring enough to look. Ethan shook his head slowly. You weren't foolish, Michelle. You were the only person in that entire mansion who was actually paying attention. Word of what happened at the Sterling estate that night didn't stay contained for long, no matter how carefully the family's lawyers tried to manage it. It started small, a guest who'd been standing near the chandelier posting a vague, breathless account on social media 2 days after the party, careful not to name names but detailed enough that anyone in Fairfield County society could piece together exactly whose wedding it was describing. By the end of the week, a financial news outlet had confirmed the broad strokes. A prominent Connecticut businessman's engagement had collapsed after his fiancée was revealed to have fabricated a disability as part of an elaborate, years-long scheme targeting his fortune. Michelle's name never appeared in any of it. Ethan had made sure of that, quietly instructing his communications team that if her name showed up in a single story, he'd know exactly who to hold responsible. But inside the walls of the estate, and within the small, tight-knit community of people who actually worked there, everyone knew. And in the weeks that followed, Michelle noticed something she hadn't expected. The other staff, people she'd worked alongside for years without ever really being seen by them, started looking at her differently. Not with pity, the way she'd sometimes been looked at before. With something closer to respect. She didn't take the house right away. It sat, deed in hand, for almost 3 weeks while Michelle wrestled with something she hadn't expected to feel, not doubt about whether she deserved it, but a strange, unfamiliar grief for the version of her life she'd been building for years without ever quite admitting how hard it had been. She'd spent 8 years telling herself that steady work and a quiet life were enough, that wanting more for herself was a kind of ingratitude she couldn't afford. Standing in the small, sunlit kitchen of the house Ethan had given her, walking through empty rooms that would soon hold her daughter's furniture, her own furniture, a life that finally had room to breathe in it, Michelle found herself crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in years, not from sadness, but from something that felt almost like relief. Amora, when she found out about the scholarship, hadn't spoken for a full minute, staring at her mother across their kitchen table like she was trying to work out if this was some kind of elaborate joke. And then she'd cried too, and hugged her mother so hard Michelle nearly lost her balance, and said, through tears, "Mom, you actually did that? You actually stood up in front of all those people." "I didn't think about the people," Michelle told her honestly. "I just thought about what your grandmother, well, not your grandmother, but the woman who was like one to me in that house, used to say. That doing the right thing quietly, when you think no one's watching, matters more than doing it loudly when everyone is." Ethan, for his part, didn't disappear from Michelle's life once the transaction of gratitude was complete. He checked in, first with the careful formality of a man unused to owing anyone anything so large, and then, gradually, with the easier warmth of someone who'd rediscovered what it felt like to trust another person without bracing for betrayal. He came to Amora's school science fair that spring, standing quietly at the back so as not to draw attention, and told Michelle afterward, with something like wonder in his voice, that watching a 12-year-old explain her volcano model with total, unself-conscious confidence had been the first genuinely uncomplicated joy he'd felt in months. Vivian, or whoever she truly was, disappeared from Connecticut entirely within a month, along with Daniel, though rumors would occasionally surface over the following year of a similar scheme attempted somewhere else, a different wealthy man in a different city, always just cautious enough to avoid the kind of concrete proof that had unraveled everything in that Greenwich foyer. Ethan never spoke of her with anger, at least not in front of Michelle. Mostly, he spoke of her the way people speak about a fever they've finally recovered from, with a kind of tired relief that it was over, and a quiet resolve never to let himself be that unguarded again without reason. It was nearly a year later, at a small dinner Ethan held at the estate, smaller, quieter, more intimate than the engagement party had ever been, just close family friends and a handful of people who mattered to him, that he stood up near the end of the evening with a glass of wine in his hand and asked for everyone's attention. "A year ago in this house," he said, looking not at the crowd of well-dressed guests around the table, but directly at Michelle, seated near the far end beside her daughter, "I almost married a lie. And the only reason I didn't is because one woman in this house had more courage than everyone else in it combined." He raised his glass slightly. "I don't think I've properly said this in front of people who matter to me. So I'm saying it now. Michelle Carter didn't just save me from a terrible mistake that night. She reminded me what it actually looks like when someone cares about you without wanting anything back." Michelle, sitting there with her daughter's hand in hers, felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with sadness at all. She hadn't done what she did for recognition. She hadn't done it hoping for a house, or a scholarship, or a toast in a room full of people who, a year earlier, would never have thought to look at her twice. She'd done it because somewhere along the way, in a house full of marble and chandeliers and quiet, careful invisibility, she'd learned the one lesson that mattered more than any of it, that being unseen by the world doesn't mean you stop seeing the truth. And sometimes, the person paying the closest attention in the room is the one nobody ever thought to notice at all. 2 years after that night beneath the chandelier, Michelle Carter's life looked almost nothing like it once had, and yet, in the ways that mattered most, it hadn't changed at all. She still worked at the Sterling estate, though worked had come to mean something different than it once did. At Ethan's quiet insistence, and after months of Michelle politely refusing what she considered too generous a promotion, she now oversaw the household staff as estate manager. A role that let her use everything she'd learned in 8 years of careful, invisible attention, except now people actually asked for her opinion instead of walking past her in the hallway. She still knew, better than anyone, which chandeliers needed polishing before which party, which caterers could be trusted with short notice, which small details made the difference between a house that simply looked expensive and one that actually felt like a home. She'd simply stopped being invisible while doing it. Amora was 13 now, thriving in a new school in their new neighborhood, her college fund quietly growing untouched in the background of a childhood that finally had room in it to dream without calculating cost. She still talked, sometimes, about the night her mother had told her the whole story for the first time, not the version that had made it, carefully sanitized, into a few gossip columns, but the real version, the one where her mother had stood in a laundry room at 11 o'clock at night with shaking hands and 11 seconds of shaky footage, trying to decide whether telling the truth was worth the risk of losing everything. "Weren't you scared?" Amora had asked her that night, curled up on the couch in their new living room. "Terrified," Michelle had admitted. "The whole time. I want you to know that, because I don't want you thinking courage means not being scared. It just means doing the right thing anyway, even when you are." Ethan, for his part, had rebuilt his life slowly, carefully, the way a person rebuilds anything after learning the hard way that they can be fooled. He hadn't remarried, though there had been, over the past year, a woman he'd started seeing quietly. A pediatric surgeon he'd met, of all places, at Amora's school auction, someone with no interest in his money and even less patience for pretense. Michelle liked her immediately, in the plain, uncomplicated way you like someone who clearly isn't performing for anyone. But it was a smaller moment, months after the dinner where Ethan had raised his glass to her in front of a room full of guests, that Michelle would find herself thinking back to most often in the years that followed. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Michelle was in the west sitting room of the estate, the same room where, 2 years earlier, she'd first heard Vivian murmur something about a magazine photo she supposedly couldn't see, checking on a delivery of fresh flowers, when Ethan found her there, holding a single framed photograph in his hand. "I found this going through some of my mother's old things," he said, holding it out to her. It was a photo Michelle hadn't seen in years, Eleanor Sterling, maybe a decade younger than Michelle had ever known her, standing in that same kitchen, laughing at something just out of frame, one hand resting on the shoulder of a much younger Michelle, barely into her 20s, who was laughing right along with her. "I don't actually remember who took this," Ethan said. "But I remember my mother talking about you constantly, even back then. She used to say the house never felt right unless you were somewhere in it." Michelle held the photograph carefully, running her thumb once over the edge of the frame, feeling something settle warmly in her chest. Not grief exactly, though there was some of that too, but something closer to a kind of quiet completion, the sense of a long, winding story finally arriving somewhere it was always meant to go. "She used to tell me," Michelle said softly, "that the people who really deserve trust are the ones who never ask for it. They just keep showing up, quietly, whether anyone's watching or not." Ethan nodded slowly. "She was right about a lot of things. But I think that might be the one that saved my life." They stood together for a moment in that sitting room, sunlight falling in long gold bars across the polished floor, two people connected not by money or obligation but by something far rarer, a debt of trust that had already, in every way that mattered, been repaid many times over. Because in the end, that was the real story beneath everything that had happened in that house. Not the scandal, not the twist, not even the astonishing wealth that had briefly made headlines for all the wrong reasons. It was simpler than that, and truer than that. It was the story of a woman who had spent years being overlooked, who understood, in her bones, that the world often fails to see the people quietly holding it together, and who chose, when it mattered most, to be seen anyway. Not for reward. Not for recognition. Simply because it was right. And if there's one thing worth carrying with you from Michelle Carter's story tonight, it's this: the truth doesn't need a loud voice to matter. Sometimes, it just needs one person brave enough to finally speak it, even in a room full of people who never thought to listen. If this story moved you tonight, that's exactly why we tell them. If you believe, like Michelle did, that quiet courage deserves to be seen, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing is always worth it. We'll see you in the next story.